My name is Boomer Talon, and today I'm going to be talking to you about transoceanic connections. Some technological innovations from 1450 to 1750 include the stern post rudder, lateen sails that allowed to sail in any direction regardless of wind, the astrolabe, the magnetic compass, three-masted caravels, the air pump, the thermometer, the barometer, the flushing toilet, the lead pencil, the globe, the printing press, Newton's laws of gravitation, better map making, and astronomical charts. Exploration causes and events from 1450 to 1750. Some events include that are very important are in 1453, the Ottoman seized Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. In 1492, Columbus sailed to the Americas, then committed mass genocide. In 1502, the first slaves were brought to the Americas, slaves being black Africans. 1517, Martin Luther wrote the 95 Theses, which was against the Catholic Church. In 1521, Cortes conquered the Aztecs. In 1526, the Mughal Empire began. In 1533, Pizarro conquered the Incas. In 1600, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan begins. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company established, first joint stock company ever. In 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War occurred. In 1624, Queen Nzinga becomes ruler of Ndongo. In 1689, the Glorious Revolution. And in 1697, Peter the Great traveled to Europe to study technology. Some other things that happened from 1450 to 1750 include trade between Europe and Asia had to go through the Mediterranean, which was controlled by the Italian city-states. The Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch had to find another route to remain competitive, so they invested in exploration. Europeans were primarily motivated by money, religion, rivalry, conquest. If they could fast a quicker route to Asia, profits would balloon and religious ideologies will spread. At this time, wealth was measured by how much gold or silver a country had on hand. So states began to practice mercantist policies, which limited imports and maximized exports. This kept more money in the bank at any given time. The Portuguese led the way to sub-Saharan Africa and present-day China, India, Indonesia, but their first-to-market advantage did not last long. The Columbian Exchange. Before 1492, the Americas were isolated from Africa, Europe, and Asia. The connection of the Old World, Afro-Eurasia, and the New World, the Americas, unlocked a massive flow of goods, people, ideas, and disease. The Europeans/Africans introduced horses, pigs, rice, wheat, grapes, African slavery, and many diseases to the Americas. The Americans introduced corn, potatoes, chocolate, tomatoes, avocados, etc. to Europe, Africa, and in Asia. The slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade began immediately after the Portuguese arrived in Africa, but seriously expanded after Native American populations were decimated. Cash crops were profitable, but required a lot of labor. Indigenous communities were originally enslaved, but they were not a viable long-term plan for free/cheap labor. The Atlantic slave trade was expanded to supply labor throughout the colonies. The most common destination for slaves was Brazil because sugar was so harsh to cultivate and that the lifespan of slaves was extremely short. 5 to 10% of slaves died every year. African diaspora. The African diaspora consists of the worldwide collection of communities descent from sub-Saharan Africans or people from sub-Saharan Africa, predominantly in the Americas. This led to a very genetically drained Africa because these people were pulled from there. Maritime empires established in the Old World, so Africa, Asia, and Europe. In West Africa, European merchants and missionaries reached inland to the Congo and Benin. The Asante Empire, and Kingdom of the Congo participated in slave trade, which increased their wealth and power. Japan initially welcomed Portuguese and Dutch traders and missionaries, then pulled back by banning Christianity and contact with the outside. They remained isolated for most of the 17th/18th centuries in an effort to protect traditional culture. China was also set on isolating itself from foreign affairs. After Zheng He's explorations, the Ming dynasty retreated into an isolationist policies. Europeans would have to wait a few centuries for access to China. The Mughals in India were open to trade with Europeans, and British East India Company was established. The East India Company took advantage of tensions between Muslims and Hindus in order to expand influence. The British moved inland and by the 19th century had direct colonial control over all of India. In the Americas, the Spanish and Portuguese divided the lands of Americas before they even explored or conquered any of it. In 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which gave Brazil to the Portuguese and everywhere else to the Spanish. Languages are still divided on these lines. North of the Spanish territory, the French-British were fueling their rivalry as they competed for land and control of resources. The French aligned with the Iroquois for protection and trading rights. The rivalry eventually popped off as the Seven Years' War exploded tensions around the world. The British drove the French out of Canada and India after that. Maritime empires maintained and developed. Mercantilistic policies of the time maximized exports and minimized imports so that the state could have more silver and gold on hand. The worldwide transformation to a trade-based economy using gold and silver is known as commercial revolution. To keep up with the global demand, joint stock companies were formed. The Dutch created a stock exchange. The two main companies were the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, obviously ruled by each other. Yeah. In the Atlantic, the consistent trade from Europe to Africa to the Americas and back to Europe was known as the triangular trade. Europeans bought manufactured goods like guns to Africa, picked up slaves to bring to the Americas, then filled up on cash crops to head back to Europe. Internal external challenges to state power from 1450 to 1750. In Portugal, the Dutch and English pushed out of South Asia, and Queen Nzinga's rebellion in modern-day Angola. France, Fronde revolt against the royal power. Russia, Cossack rebellion and Pugachevek rebellion. Mughals, Maratha rebellion. Spanish, Pueblo and Apache revolt in present-day New Mexico. British, Maroon Wars in Jamaica. The Gloucester County Slave Rebellion in Virginia. Metacom's War in New England. And Glorious Revolution, Catholics versus Protestants. This was in actual England. Changing social hierarchies from 1450 to 1750. In China, which was ruled by the kings, they committed to making the Manchu culture dominant, and the majority of Han ethnicity was faced the most intolerance from the king. Europe, which was ruled by a family, this is Western Europe, was ruled by a family that gained enormous wealth from trade and corruption. Below the royals was a second class of nobility, a small wealthy group that owned most of the land, called the nobles. And the commoners were the lowest class and often challenged the nobility. This is what will lead to all the revolutions after 1750. In the Americas, the most dramatic social changes happened in the Americas because of the influx of Europeans, decimation of indigenous peoples, and explosion of the African slave trade. Social classes in the Americas were based on race, which is pivotal difference from the rest of the world, often in this order. Europeans mixed, which could be Europeans mixed with natives and Europeans mixed with blacks, and then natives, and then black slaves. Continuity and change from 1450 to 1750 in Europe. Continuities. The continued practice of Christianity, continued use of the Latin written language, and the continued use of legal codes. Changes. The emergence of Protestant Christianity, increased economic growth, the emergence of global European empires, the decline of serfdom as a labor system in Western Europe, the High Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the beginning of the European Enlightenment, the introduction of American crops, the emergence of new seafaring technologies. In Africa, continuities. Continued trans-Saharan trade, continued practice of animistic religions, continued practice of hunting and gathering, persistence in stateless societies, and continued practice of Christianity in Ethiopia. Changes: the beginning of European empires in coastal Africa, the emergence of transatlantic slave trade, the rise of Songhai Empire in West Africa, the introduction of gunpowder weaponry, the imbalance of gender ratios due to slave trade in parts of Africa, and the introduction of American crops. In the Middle East, continued practice of Christianity, continued existence of empires, the continued reliance on camels for transportation, the continued existence of regional trade, the continued seclusion of women, the continued importance of tribal and clan identities, the continued existence of slavery, the continued use of metal coinage, and the persistence of land-based trade. Changes: the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, the introduction of American crops, the rise of the Shah Safavid Empire in Iran, and the increased trade with Europe. In the Americas, continued the beginning of transatlantic trading system, the beginning of Encominia, system. In China and Japan, continuities. The continued reliance on Confucianism as a political system, the continued use of civil service examination system, the continued practice of Confucianism as a belief system, the continued practice of Taoism as a belief system, the continued practice of Buddhism as a belief system, the continued practice of Buddhism as a belief system, the continued emphasis of filial piety, the continued patriarchal system under Confucianism, and the continued existence of long-distance trade routes. Changes: increasing European presence, introduction of Christianity, the rise of the Ming Dynasty, the conversion of some Chinese by the Jesuits, the increased level of trade, the isolation of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, and the decline of the samurai class in Tokugawa Japan. In India, continuities: continued practice of Hinduism, persistence of caste system, continued control of the northern India by Muslim governments, continued sea-based trade in the Indian Ocean, continued land-based trade along a branch of Silk Roads. The emergence of Sikhism, the rise of Mughal dynasty, the increased presence of European powers along coastal India, increased importance of European traders in the Indian Ocean. Southeast Asia, continuities: the continued practice of Buddhism, the persistence of spice trade, the continued influence of Chinese culture and political ideas. Changes: the spread of Islam via trade routes, strong European demand for spices, the increased Dutch presence in Southeast Asia, the conquest of the Philippines by the Spanish, the introduction of European languages and culture. Thanks for watching. That's the end.